In the second part of 3, we're going to look to plant sub-analysis leaves versus fruits, with a special focus on potassium versus fruit quality. We tested the variety Johanita on 3 different fields. We sampled the fields every 2 weeks with a total of 12 times, and fruits were sampled from July 1st up until harvest. And on the right side you see a picture of the Johanita. We saw already that around harvest there was a big difference on fruit quality. So on one of the fields there were a lot of trusses with rotten fruits, and compared to the other 2 fields where the quality was still good, we didn't saw any rotten fruit. So one of the fields was really bad, and we wanted to look to the nutrient differences between those 3 fields to figure out if it's related to any nutrients. Now, one of the reasons could already be of a storm we had just before harvest, or say 3 weeks before harvest. On September 9th and 15th, we got 30 to 40 millimeters of rain. And as you can see with the sugar levels in the fruits, a big drop after that storm. So the high amount of rain brought a lot of water into the fruits, which diluted the sugars, and of course puts more pressure on the skin of the fruits, which can more easily lead to cracks and rotten. But if we look to the potassium uptake, then it's interesting that we see a big difference between location V, which was the location with those rotten fruits, and the 2 other fields. So the 2 other fields were over the whole season good within the target values. So we look at the minimum target value over here, the gray line, and the upper gray line is the maximum target value. With plant sub-analysis, we look to the straight line, which are the old leaves, and the young leaves are the dotted lines. And you see already that the blue line was showing the highest potassium uptake, so much higher than the 2 other fields. Now, potassium plays an important role in fruit quality because potassium brings more water into the fruits, or comes together with the water uptake. So more potassium is also more pressure on the skin of the fruits, which can more easily lead to cracks. So the first big difference was already the potassium between the 2 other fields. Also in the fruits, we see a difference in uptake as expected. Location V showed the highest potassium levels in the fruits, and especially at the end and in the middle of the season. You see already big differences in potassium uptake. If we then look to some pictures we made with every sampling moment, then we see that on the 17th of September, where we also saw the highest levels of potassium in the leaves, already a lot of berries with cracked fruits. Basically all the red circles show berries with or cracked fruit or already rotten. So, and as you can see, this is not from the last 2-3 days. Now those cracks were already in an earlier stage. So basically from the beginning of August, the potassium levels got too high, and somewhere around this time, the first cracks came in the berries. So on the moment, the potassium levels got too high. And we didn't saw that on the 2 other fields. Now, if we then look to the potassium availability in the soil, then we see that location V was also showing the highest levels of potassium in the soil. Not higher than the ideal levels, but on the upper range. And compared to location K and location G, which were basically even lower than the ideal levels, but even being lower, it still led to a good enough potassium uptake. So even though levels in the soil are too low, it can still lead to a good uptake. But the levels in location V were definitely too high for this location because it pushed the levels of potassium up too high. Now, if we then look to the calcium uptake, because calcium has also an important role in the fruit quality, there we see that the overall calcium uptake was good. It was higher than the target values. It was even above the target values. But again, we know that potassium has an antagonistic interaction with calcium. So too high potassium leads to a lower calcium uptake. And as you see, the overall calcium uptake, especially old leaves and young leaves, were with an average lower than the two other fields, even though it was not shown a big difference. Then if we look to the potassium calcium ratio in the leaves, then again, the blue line shows the highest levels. And also in the fruits, you see that the potassium calcium ratio, especially at the end, showed a big difference with the two other fields. So too much potassium compared to calcium. Not only the calcium was limited in uptake by the potassium, but potassium is also antagonistic to magnesium. And as you see, the blue line again was showing the lowest levels of magnesium, all because the potassium was blocking or limiting the uptake of magnesium. Now, all three fields were basically too low over the whole season. So all three fields were showing magnesium deficiency, but the most deficiency we saw at location V with the lowest uptake. Now, another reason of the rotten fruits could be too high ammonium or too high total nitrogen levels in the berries, so in the fruits. But as you see over here, the blue line wasn't showing the highest levels compared to the two other fields. So not on the ammonium and not on the nitrogen. So most probably the nitrogen and ammonium didn't have an effect on those cracked fruits and eventually those rotten fruits. And if we look to boron, because boron is important for fruit set, then it's interesting that the boron uptake on location V was definitely much lower than the two other fields, and it was even lower than our target values. We also see that in the fruits that the boron uptake was lower. Now, boron is important for fruit set, so that could be a reason that on further development of the fruits, the boron had a negative influence on that because of that too low uptake. But still, I think the main reason of the bad fruit quality, if we look to nutrition, would be the potassium, which was too high in the leaves, eventually too high in the fruits, put more pressure on the skin of the fruits, which lead to cracks and eventually to those rotten fruits. So keep your potassium within the target values to prevent this kind of problems.